After my mom passed away, I began urban exploring, also known as urbex. It gave me a much-needed escape from our house. Everywhere that I looked, sharp-edged memories threatened to cut me open. The pictures that she had chosen to decorate the walls, or the armchair that she loved to curl up in. Channel 5 floated through our home, an ever-present ghost. More importantly, urbex transformed the ordinary into the magical. That magic never lasted, but even a few seconds was enough for me. A few seconds to pretend that Mom was still alive. I met Charlotte in 9th grade when Mrs. Langdon asked us to do a group presentation on Measure for Measure. Charlotte's the exact opposite of me, bubbly and outgoing and extroverted, but we bonded over our mutual love for urbex. Together, we visited the Chester Hudson Quarry, Danvers State Hospital, Clinton Tunnel, and much more. We continuously challenged each other to check out bigger, creepier places, and quickly became best friends. Before Charlotte left to study history at Brown, we agreed that we would meet up during our breaks from college to continue exploring different places. Kilmoure was our white whale. We had learned about it before the internet became widely accessible, from a newspaper article that listed all the ghost towns in Massachusetts. At the time, we hadn't been able to find out much more. Admittedly, our efforts had been hampered by my dad. After Mom died, his protectiveness multiplied by 100-fold. He became a stereotypical tiger parent, always demanding to know where I went, and insisting that I spent all my free time studying for the SATs, instead of running through neglected buildings. Almost 4 years had passed since we had first heard of Kilmoure. Charlotte was the one who had figured out that it had initially been called Kiltmoure when it was first founded, which explained why we had had such a difficult time finding out more information about it. Once we had had the town name, we pieced together its history and location. Kiltmoure or Kilmoure had been founded in the late 1600s as an inland settlement. It declined after the American Revolution had ended, and a town called Larton rose into prominence. People built new coastal roads, ones that ran right past Kilmoure straight to Larton. During the War of 1812, even more people moved away. Rumors surrounded the very last occupants of Kilmoure. People accused them of practicing human sacrifice. Charlotte and I decided to explore Kilmoure on March 15th, right when our spring breaks coincided. Our phones died as soon as we had entered the town. In retrospect, we should have packed up and left then, but we were too excited, too pleased with ourselves to consider leaving. We had no idea what waited for us there. It was a beautiful summer day, the kind you long for in the dead of winter when cloudless skies and warmth seem like an impossible dream. We drove up to Kilmoure singing along with the yeah yeah yeahs, while Charlotte consulted Google Maps. I daydreamed about all the amazing photos we would share with the online urbex community. To the best of my knowledge, Charlotte and I would be the first ones to explore Kilmoure. We parked on the hill overlooking Kilmoure. When Charlotte turned off the car engine, a thick silence settled in our ears, only broken intermittently by a crow cawing somewhere far above us. "Do you have everything?" I asked. "A respirator, first aid kit, flashlight, water." I knew she did, but we had gotten into the habit of checking with each other before going in. The half-face respirators were especially important because they protected our lungs from asbestos, mold, and even hantavirus. "Yup, I brought some extra food too," said Charlotte. She patted the side of her bulging backpack. "And my Canon 5D. Excitement surged through me as we walked down the hill. We had dreamed about visiting Kilmoure for so long, and now we were finally here. It looked almost exactly like I thought it would. Nature had reclaimed most of the town, crowning it with wreaths of moss and robes of vines. While some of these stone houses stood tall and unbroken, Others had been gutted down to their bones, and trees erupted out of crumbling walls. The largest building of them all stood at the center of the town. A school, maybe. I squinted at it. No, it was a church. The cross, meant to be at the top of the steeple, was missing. My phone vibrated. I looked down and saw that the battery had dropped to 1%, even though I had charged it in Charlotte's car the whole drive up. Weird. I noticed Charlotte checking her phone too. Good thing we hadn't planned on using our phones to take pictures and videos. Did I know then that we should have turned around and run away as far as possible? Not exactly, but I would be lying if I said I hadn't experienced a moment's unease. Partially because of our phones dying, meant that if one of us had an accident here, we wouldn't be able to reach emergency services right away. Mostly though, that sense of unease remained undefined. It was the kind you feel when you're walking down an empty street late at night, and you hear someone's footsteps echoing behind you. By unspoken agreement, we decided to explore the abandoned church first. Our plan was to slowly work our way outwards through the rest of the town. Unlike many of the other buildings, the church seemed relatively untouched by the ravages of time. It was made of gray stone covered with moss, roughly shaped like a pentagon, and had a bell tower from which a single rusted bell hung. I suspected that if it weren't for its missing cross, this church would have looked right at home in a modern small town in New England. The doors to the church opened easily under my touch. The smell hit us right away. It reminded me of the time I had accidentally left a Tupperware full of cooked chicken in the fridge for 2 weeks. By the time that I had remembered it existed, the smell of spoiled meat after I had opened it nearly made me throw up. I concentrated on breathing through my mouth until I could walk inside of the church without gagging. Although the church had windows, the light streaming through them wasn't strong enough for me to make out our surroundings clearly. I turned my flashlight on and saw a bunch of pews, 8 rows of them. They had all been pushed to the side, as though the congregation members had left in a hurry. In the middle of the church, at the center of all the hastily pushed aside pews, was a giant hole in the ground, approximately 15 feet wide. It had rough edges of splintered wood. Fascinated, I moved closer. The darkness inside of it was impenetrable. I had the oddest sensation that there was something down there looking back up at me. I knelt down and tossed in a pebble. I counted until 7 before hearing the distant clack that signaled the pebble had landed. "Eliza, look at this." Charlotte used her flashlight to illuminate a wooden pulpit at the very front of the room past the hole. Cobwebs and grime hid its intricate carvings from view. On top of the pulpit sat a stone bust, roughly 3 feet tall. I trained my flashlight on it. At first, I couldn't make sense of what the sculpture was meant to depict. It seemed to have a human neck and face, but from its mouth upwards, its nose and eyes dissolved into numerous writhing snakes that then spiraled up into 2 twisted horns. Its mouth gaped wide open, the jaw dislocated in a soundless scream. I looked down to make sure the ground ahead of us was stable. A thick layer of dust covered everything, except I aimed the flashlight at the aisle leading to the hole and nearly forgot how to breathe. Footprints disturbed the dust. Small footprints. The footprints of children. So freshly made that they might have walked through here only seconds ago. "Someone's here. Someone's playing a prank on us." Charlotte's voice made me jump. I spun around to see her staring down at the footprints too. Her voice had been so flat and emotionless that if I hadn't been able to see the beam of her flashlight trembling wildly, I would have said she was completely unaffected. "Yeah," I said, trying to smile at her. "They probably thought it would be funny to scare us. Remember the time some idiot dressed up as a mannequin and put it by the hospital entrance?" She managed a shaky laugh. "Yeah, that scared the crap out of me. Is it just me or do you feel like barfing too?" Now that you mention it, I hadn't noticed before, too engrossed in looking around, but I didn't feel so hot. My stomach kept folding over itself, sending up waves of nausea. Sweat poured down my forehead and stung my eyes. My respirator was working, I knew that it was. So why was I having such a bad physical reaction to simply being inside of a building? Without warning, the ground started shaking under our feet. I froze for a second, hoping that the church wasn't about to collapse and fall onto us. "Let's go," I shouted, hoping that Charlotte could hear me. Fortunately, we seemed to be on the same page. We both backed out of the church and started running back the way that we had arrived. Less fortunately, the ground kept sending us stumbling over our own feet, and we struggled to stay upright. As abruptly as it had started, the earthquake stopped. And that was when the town changed. Everything around us wavered. The buildings flickered for a moment and looked whole and intact again. People streamed out of them. People who wore old-fashioned clothing that didn't belong in the 21st century. The men wore breeches, the women woolen petticoats. Children ran around wearing doublets or gowns. We had been transported back in time, or more accurately, the town had been transported back in time. Charlotte hissed, "This has to be a historical reenactment of some sort. They're actors." Instead of answering her, I said, "Come on, follow me." We ran around one of the houses next to the church and crouched down behind it, hopefully out of view. Right in time. The church doors slammed open with a loud thud and people poured in. They had no faces. None of the townspeople had faces. No eyes, and no nose, and no mouth. Only a smooth, blank surface, like dolls that had come to life. But they seemed aware, capable of conscious thought. I watched as a couple of them paused in the street, tilting their heads to one side as though speaking to each other. I noticed something else too. There was a procession of townspeople headed towards the church. The elderly led the way, all three of them hunched over. One used a cane to support himself as he hobbled forward. Others followed them. Based on their height, they were most likely middle-aged adults. Teenagers brought up the very end of the procession. The church doors closed behind them. Only young children remained outside. Screams of agony filled the air. They went on and on, horrible and unending. Even clapping my hands over my ears didn't help. I still heard them. After a few minutes, the screams ended and blood poured out from underneath the church doors in a thick flood, soaking into the earth. We both backed away from it rapidly, neither of us wanting to be near it. The ground rumbled underneath our feet, sending us sprawling again. All the children outside of the church keened in distress, dropping to their knees and holding their arms into the air as though they were praying. I looked at their tearless, blank faces, my skin crawling with revulsion. How could they cry or scream without any mouths? I wanted and needed to be back in the car, safely behind the wheel and preferably driving far away from here. There was something very wrong with Kilmoure, and I didn't plan on sticking around to see more. "Let's try to make it back to the car." I pointed at the surrounding woods. "Through there." I tore off my respirator. There seemed to be no point in keeping it on. Cautiously, slowly, we shuffled through the woods, ducking behind trees whenever possible. But right as we had reached the bottom of the hill, between one blink and the next, we were somehow transported back to the house that we had been hiding behind. Disoriented, I stepped forward and collided straight into Charlotte. Her dark brown hair was plastered to her face in sweaty strings. Above the respirator, her eyes showed the same confusion that I felt. What was going on? This time, I didn't bother trying to be stealthy or quiet. Instead, I simply ran for it, leaping over fallen logs and ducking under low-hanging tree branches. I was certain that I would be able to leave if I just ran fast enough. I knew that I was moving forward. I had to be. But my feet stopped leading me towards the hill on which our cars were parked. Or maybe the path itself had changed underneath me. Instead of running away, I ran back towards the house where Charlotte stood. We couldn't leave. I pushed away that realization, the way that you would push away some stranger intruding on your personal space. I didn't want to think through what that meant. Maybe we can ask the kids for help. I instinctively knew that we did not want to draw their attention. No, Charlotte, don't. I lunged for her, but I wasn't quick enough. She had walked out onto the street, everything about her wildly out of place, from the clothes that she was wearing to the backpack that she held at her side. The children didn't notice her. Hope swept through me. They had no eyes, so maybe they couldn't even see her. But then they started running towards Charlotte, their blank faces shiny and unreadable. She faltered, stopped, and turned to run. She made it about 5 feet before they converged on her and pulled her down. Someone shrieked loudly next to me. I whipped my head around to see a young boy leaning out from the open window of the nearby house, pointing at me while he screamed. I hesitated, uncertain. I needed to run, but I didn't want to leave Charlotte behind. The choice was taken from me. Cold hands grabbed my shoulders and arms, dragging me forward. I knew with a sudden flash of terror where they intended on taking us. I struggled against the tiny hands holding me, trying to wrench myself free. I kicked at them, scratched them, even tried to bite them, but they didn't seem to feel any pain. Eventually, I stopped struggling and went limp, letting my legs drag behind me. I hoped that they might drop me, or at least slow down under my weight. Neither happened. They held me with unnatural strength. The church loomed over us. They dragged us inside and I cried out involuntarily. The smell from earlier, that scent of rotten decay, was back. And worse, red had been splashed everywhere, all over the floor and onto the walls. The pews had puddles of blood. It even ran from the ceiling, falling on us like warm rain. Thicker things dripped down as well. Things inside a body that you weren't meant to feel against your bare skin. There was the hole in the middle of the church that we had seen before. It was smaller now, but I still couldn't see how deep it ran. Something in the darkness down there stirred as though it felt my gaze. I tried not to think about the fact that it looked just like a gaping, hungry mouth, one eagerly waiting to swallow us. Charlotte screamed, "Please, please, don't do this to us. It was a mistake. We made a mistake. You can't do this to us because of a mistake." The children ignored her. Those who weren't holding on to us dropped to their hands and knees. They abased themselves and made a sighing, whimpering sound. She kept pleading, "Please, you have to listen to me. We're sorry and we didn't mean to come here." A voice came out of the hole in the ground. It spoke to me. I don't know what or whom Charlotte heard, but it spoke to me in my mother's voice. Suddenly, I wasn't standing in the middle of a desecrated church covered by red and surrounded by faceless children. I sat in my mom's lap, only my feet sticking out, like when I had been much younger. Her arms held me, and I could smell her perfume, Chanel 5, and the clean scent of Dove soap. Her soft black hair spilled over my face. I tried to swallow past the lump in my throat. I had missed her so much. Tears trickled down my face. "Mommy's so glad you made it here, Elisa." She kissed my forehead, leaving a waxy imprint of lipstick behind. "I won't leave you again, honey. All you have to do is say yes." The arms tightened around me in a hug, one that hurt. I opened my mouth to say yes. Yes, I wanted to stay here. I never wanted to leave again. And I jerked back. I had been pressed up against her cheek, but instead of that strong, sure heartbeat that I remembered, only silence greeted me. No heartbeat. "Elisa, do you hear me?" I stared up at my mom and met familiar dark brown eyes. "All you have to do is say yes, honey. Say that and you'll always be mine. Say you'll worship me, obey me, follow me." She stroked my hair. "We can be here together forever." I dug my fingernails into my palms, hard enough that they started to bleed. The pain helped clear my head. I badly wanted to say yes, to stay here with my mom forever, but this wasn't really her. My mom was dead. I watched the realization slide into those familiar eyes. The realization that I knew it was just pretending to be my mom. "It can be as real as you want it to be, Elisa. I can be real for you. Look around yourself. There is no death here. The people in this town agreed to stay with me forever, and they always will." It smiled, an awful, vicious smile that didn't belong in my mom's face. I thought I understood. No one in this town could move on. They were stuck repeating these same motions, doing the same things, in an endless loop. Hurting each other, hurting themselves, all in worship of the thing that lived below this church. I shook my head wordlessly. My mom wavered before me, shimmering like a heat haze. Abruptly, she vanished. I opened my eyes to see that I had walked closer to the hole, so close that I could see the faceless children throwing themselves down into it ahead of me. I stumbled backwards. A terrible tearing noise filled the air. The sound of something meaty being ripped apart. The snap and click of enormous teeth. Blood erupted out of the hole in the ground in a vast torrent. Chunks of thick, glistening flesh, shards of teeth and bone, exploded into the air and splattered all over me, the walls, and the ceiling. Everything. Charlotte walked past me. I staggered over to her. "Stop it, Charlotte, stop walking." But she didn't. Not knowing what else to do, I grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her, sending her head snapping back and forth. Charlotte's eyes cleared momentarily. "Elisa, what's going on? I feel so strange." She started to move out of my grip. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had to do, and I forcibly dragged her towards the church doors. Each step was a struggle. She clawed at me, screaming, fighting to go back to that mesmerizing voice that had promised her paradise. I told myself to hang in there, that this would all be over soon. I had to tell myself that, or I would have given up and left her there after all. Behind us, the very last faceless child screamed. I looked back even though I knew I shouldn't. I couldn't help it. Something exploded out of the ground, something huge and monstrous that sent slivers of wood flying across the church. I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. It was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with only a third of the pieces. I caught a glimpse of teeth, needles sharp and utterly inhuman, and enormous horns that spiraled into the ceiling of the church. Whatever it was, it tore apart the child in its grasp. It ripped the skin off her body the way an amorous man ripped off his lover's dress. Flesh red sprayed through the air, and I choked on it, nearly slipping to the ground. As soon as we had stumbled out of the church, Charlotte crumpled to the ground and started to sob. I wondered for a moment if we would even be able to leave, or if we would end up back here no matter how many times we ran away. As if in answer to my unspoken question, the ground beneath us began trembling again. The buildings collapsed and disappeared, swallowed up by an enormous fissure in the ground that widened as it raced towards us. I dragged Charlotte up to her feet and we ran for it. She threw one quick glance over her shoulder, her face twisted in misery. I didn't know whose voice she had heard. If we made it out alive, maybe I would ask her. And then I stopped wondering what she had seen because I had to direct all my attention towards putting one foot in front of the other. I could hear my mom again. Knowing that it wasn't really her didn't help. I kept smelling her perfume, feeling her hair slide across my face. I remember my dad telling me that Mom had been in a terrible accident, that the injuries had been too severe. "Don't leave me, Eliza. Don't leave me to die." I closed my eyes and pictured her standing in front of me again, one hand reaching out to beg for help. No, she wasn't standing. She was falling back down the hole, tumbling helplessly through the air like a broken doll. The walls and ceiling of the church crumbled and fell on top of her, burying her alive. She'd be trapped down there, left to starve away. She screamed and screamed, and I started screaming too because it was unbearable. I had to make it stop. My mom was dying again. I could taste Chanel 5 in my throat, could feel the delicate bones in her hands as she squeezed my arm, her fingernails biting into my skin. I had stopped running, stopped moving at all. I vaguely understood that Charlotte was trying to drag me forward, but most of my mind was occupied with resisting the urge to run straight back to the church. If I ran now, I could still make it in time to save her. She wouldn't starve. No. That thing wasn't my mom. I dropped to my hands and knees and started crawling up the hill. It didn't help. I could still see her, and soon it became more than just seeing. I was right there with her, the stones crushing my limbs and pinning me still. The dirt smothered me, filled my nose and mouth, and I couldn't breathe anymore. I heard her crying my name, felt her arms tighten around me for the last time, and a blood-soaked darkness swallowed my world. I came back to myself gradually. I was lying down in the backseat of someone's car, Charlotte's car. I pushed myself up to one elbow and saw Charlotte in the driver's seat, her eyes huge and terrified. They flicked up to the rearview mirror and met mine briefly before turning back to the road. Neither of us spoke. I didn't care where we were, or even where we were going, as long as we got the heck away from Kilmoure. Charlotte and I drifted apart. For some people, going through something traumatic together forges indestructible bonds. For others, it breaks them apart. We couldn't heal from what had happened together. All we could do was remind each other of the worst moment of our lives. The last I heard, she had dropped out of Brown and moved back home. That was about 4 months ago, and I don't know where she is now. I haven't gone urban exploring since that day in Kilmoure. I can't. Every time I step into an unlit building now, even my own apartment, I remember standing in that church and seeing red spurting out of the hole. My chest seizes up and I can't breathe. Not until I turn on all the lights. Worse than that though, I dream of my mom almost every single night. Not as she was alive, but as I saw her in Kilmoure, buried under mounds of broken stones and pieces of wood and dirt, trapped and slowly dying, begging me to save her. I reach out to help her, to pull her up, and realize too late that she doesn't have a face anymore. Whenever I wake up from one of these nightmares, I always find myself walking down the road, on my way back to Kilmoure. So, I wrote this post to warn you. You and everyone else on this forum who loves urbex, who is interested in visiting ghost towns. Massachusetts has a variety of abandoned places, in addition to the ones that I had mentioned earlier. The Chester Hudson Quarry, Danvers State Hospital and Clinton Tunnel. There's also the North Truro Air Station, Rutland Prison Camp, and Steinhardt Hall. All of them are great places to explore. Just don't go to a ghost town called Kilmoure. You won't make it back out.